Let me ask you something right now, and I want you to answer in your own head before we even go any further. If your child's life was hanging by a thread and the only way to save them was to give a part of yourself, your blood, your bone marrow, even your heart if it came to it, would you hesitate? I know for a fact most of you watching wouldn't think twice. That's exactly where I was just a few weeks ago. Sitting in that cold, fluorescent hospital room, my hands clenched so tight they ached, staring at my little girl lying pale and motionless in a bed that seemed way too big for her small body. I remember the smell, that sharp, sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with something metallic, something that made me taste fear in the back of my throat. The doctor had come in, his expression tense but hopeful, and told me, "We can stabilize her, but she needs a blood transfusion. Your type is the best match. If you're willing, we can start right away." And I didn't even blink before saying yes. Because she's my daughter. Of course I would. And here's where I want you to lean in, because this, right here, is where everything you think you know about family, about trust, about the people closest to you, gets turned upside down. I'm about to tell you something that, at first, you might not even believe. Something that will make you question how well you really know the people in your life. I went into that hospital certain of who I was, certain of the life I'd built, certain of the little girl lying there with her tiny fingers twitching every now and then. But when they came back with the blood test results, everything cracked open. And before we're done here, you're going to get the answer you came for, the real reason the hospital called me unrelated to my own child. But to understand why that word hit me like a bullet, you have to come with me to that exact moment and feel exactly what I felt. The nurse had that look. You know, the one where they're trying to keep their face neutral but their eyes give it away. She was holding a clipboard, her knuckles pale from gripping it too hard. She glanced at the doctor, then back at me and said softly, "We need to talk to you privately." And instantly my stomach dropped. Because when someone says that in a hospital, it's never good news. But I didn't know, not yet, that what they were about to tell me would completely rewrite my life. Now, if you've been following stories like these on YouTube, the DNA test gone wrong stories, the family secrets videos, the truth hidden for decades, you know how your mind starts spinning, right? You try to predict the twist before it comes. You're probably already guessing, maybe my wife cheated. Maybe there was a mix-up at the hospital when my daughter was born. Maybe I was adopted and didn't know it. But I'm telling you, none of the guesses you're making right now will prepare you for the truth I'm about to reveal. The nurse led me into this tiny consultation room, beige walls, one narrow window that looked out over the parking lot where rain was smearing the view into a watercolor blur. The doctor followed behind and the door clicked shut. I could hear the hum of the vending machine outside and the faint beeping from the ER monitors down the hall. And then, silence. He cleared his throat and said, "Your blood type is a perfect match for the transfusion. But there's something unusual in the genetic markers." I frowned, not fully understanding. "What do you mean unusual?" And then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sir, biologically speaking, you are not related to your daughter." I swear the air went out of the room. My ears were ringing so loud I could barely hear my own voice when I whispered, "What are you talking about?" "That's my daughter. I was there when she was born." He didn't answer right away, just slid a printed lab report toward me, a mess of numbers and letters that might as well have been written in another language. All I could see was the bold line near the bottom, probability of paternity, 0%. And you know what's strange? In that split second, before the confusion and anger fully hit, there was this cold wave of shame, like somehow I'd been caught in a lie I didn't even know I was telling. I want you to remember that feeling, because as I take you deeper into this story, you're going to realize that this was only the beginning. This wasn't just about a lab result. This wasn't even just about my daughter. This was about a secret someone had been hiding from me for years. A secret so dangerous that the moment I started asking questions, people began trying to stop me from finding out the truth. And I don't mean they told me to drop it, or let it go. I mean, things started happening. My phone getting strange calls in the middle of the night. My wife avoiding my eyes when I asked her about the hospital results. And then, something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, a note slid under my front door one morning that said, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." If you're still here watching this, I promise you're going to get the full answer before we're done. But right now, you need to understand that the moment I heard the words, "You're unrelated," I wasn't just a father trying to save his daughter's life anymore. I became something else. Someone who needed to know what was real and what was a lie, no matter how much it cost me. And the first step toward that truth was going to take me somewhere I never thought I'd go. Back into a past I didn't even know I had, to a night that changed everything, a night that someone has been trying very hard to make me forget. And that's where I have to leave you, for now. Because if I tell you what I found next before you're ready, it won't hit the way it's supposed to. You need to hear it exactly the way I did, with your heart in your throat, your mind racing, and that one word echoing in your head over and over: unrelated. I sat in that cramped consultation room long after the doctor left, my hands still gripping the lab report like it was some kind of lifeline, even though every word on it felt like it was pulling me under. I kept thinking about the last few weeks, trying to make sense of how I'd ended up here, and it's strange because nothing about my life had seemed unusual before that moment. My days had been predictable in the kind of way you don't notice until it's gone. Wake up early, make coffee, kiss my wife goodbye as she left for work, drop my daughter at school, head to my job, and come home in the evening to dinner and cartoons playing in the background while my little girl curled up beside me on the couch. There was comfort in that rhythm, and I guess I thought that meant it was safe. But now, looking back, I can see little cracks in the routine that I either ignored or didn't want to see. There had been nights when my wife would disappear into the backyard to take calls she said were from work, speaking in a tone too hushed for me to catch a word. There had been the time she came home with her shirt buttoned wrong, like she'd gotten dressed in a rush somewhere else. And there was my daughter, smiling, sweet, my entire world, but every now and then she would ask questions about family in a way that seemed different. Like once, when she asked if she could call me by my first name just for fun. I laughed it off, but now, that memory feels like someone pressing a bruise. The weeks leading up to her hospitalization had been a blur. She'd had a fever that wouldn't break, and her energy was slipping away no matter how many doctor visits we made. They told us it was an infection, something treatable, but then one night I found her slumped over her coloring book, her crayon still in her hand, breathing shallow and fast. We rushed to the ER, and that's when the transfusion came into play. That was supposed to be the easy part, the part one could help with, but instead it turned into this unraveling of everything I thought was true. And here's where I want you to start thinking like I was forced to think, because if you were in my shoes right now, who would you look at first? Would you start with your spouse, the person who promised to share their life with you? Or would you start wondering about the hospital, about whether some mix-up years ago meant you were raising someone else's child? Or would you go even further back and start asking yourself questions about your own family, your own history, and whether someone has been lying to you for much longer than you realized? I couldn't stop my mind from running in circles. Every time I tried to imagine confronting my wife, I could already see her expression, the mix of indignation and hurt she always wore when I questioned her about anything. And then I thought about my parents, both gone now, who had been there when my daughter was born, smiling as they held her for the first time. If this was all some kind of mistake, wouldn't they have known? Or had they been keeping something from me too? I thought about friends, neighbors, even the people at the hospital. Maybe this wasn't about biology at all. Maybe someone was trying to wedge themselves between me and my daughter for reasons I couldn't see yet. And the more I thought about it, the more faces came to mind. The new neighbor who seemed to take an unusual interest in my family. My wife's co-worker, a man I'd met only once but who'd managed to make a joke about my daughter's eyes being so different from mine. Even the pediatrician who'd hesitated once when I asked a question about her growth chart, like there was something she wasn't saying. The problem is, once doubt creeps in, it spreads like wildfire. You start looking at every detail differently. I started replaying conversations in my head, noticing pauses, glances, things that didn't seem strange before but now felt loaded with meaning. Even my daughter's artwork caught my attention. She'd drawn our family more than once, but lately she'd been leaving me out of the pictures, or replacing me with a taller man with darker hair. When I asked about it, she just shrugged and said, "That's my other dad," like it was the most normal thing in the world. My wife brushed it off, saying kids imagine things all the time, but there was a flicker in her eyes that told me she wasn't as casual about it as she pretended to be. By the time I left that consultation room and walked back into the main hospital corridor, I felt like I was moving through a different version of my life. People passed me in scrubs, carrying charts and talking into headsets, but I barely heard them. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, there was a new message from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature, just 3 words, "She's not yours." My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought maybe it was some kind of cruel prank. But deep down I knew it was connected. Connected to the test results, connected to my wife's late-night calls, connected to something bigger than I'd been willing to imagine. And here's the thing, when you're staring at a situation like this, you can't help but start looking at everyone as a suspect. Your wife, your friends, even the stranger in the elevator who stood too close and looked at you a second too long. Someone knew something, and I was going to find out who. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I realized this wasn't just about a secret in my family. This was about someone's plan, and I was already tangled in it before I even knew it existed. And that's when I started to notice the first real sign that someone was watching me. I wish I could tell you that I left the hospital that day with a clear plan, that I knew exactly how I was going to get to the bottom of all this. But the truth is, I walked out of there into the rain feeling like I was stepping into some kind of shadow world where everything I thought was real might be an illusion. The parking lot was half empty, the puddles reflecting the gray sky, and I noticed a man sitting in a dark sedan a few rows over. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't looking at anything except me. I held his gaze for a second, expecting him to look away, but he didn't. Only when I unlocked my car did he finally turn the key in his ignition and drive off slowly, like he wanted me to see him leave. My first instinct was to brush it off, tell myself it was nothing, but something about the timing felt too deliberate. I decided the first thing I needed to do was get a copy of the full hospital file. Not just the blood test results, the whole thing from the moment my daughter was admitted. I wanted to see every note, every nurse's comment, every lab reading. But when I went back to request it, the receptionist's polite smile faltered. She tapped on her keyboard, frowned, and told me there seemed to be a technical error with the system. "Come back tomorrow," she said. I pressed her, telling her it was urgent, that my daughter's life was at stake. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough that I had to strain to hear. "Sir, if I were you, I'd be careful what I'm asking for." And just like that, she straightened up and went back to her default smile, like the words had never left her mouth. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, trying to pull up any public medical records that might connect to the hospital's database. I'd barely gotten past the login screen when my browser froze, then shut down completely. A warning popped up on my screen saying my IP address had been blocked due to security concerns. My wife was in the living room, pretending to watch TV but not really paying attention. I caught her glancing over at me a few times, and each time our eyes met, she would quickly look away. I wanted to ask her directly about the blood test, but something in her body language told me I wouldn't get the truth. Not yet. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to the inside of our mailbox. No return address, no handwriting, just a single typed page inside. It was a photocopy of a birth certificate, except the name listed under father wasn't mine. The rest of the information, date, hospital, city, was exactly the same as my daughter's. My heart pounded as I read and reread it, trying to make sense of it. Was this real? A forgery? And if it was fake, who would go to the trouble of making it? I thought about showing it to the police, but something told me they wouldn't take it seriously without proof that a crime had been committed. Around noon, I got a call from my old friend Mark, someone I hadn't seen in months. He sounded hesitant, almost nervous, asking if we could meet somewhere private. When I pressed him, he just said, "It's about your family. I think you need to know what's going on." We met in the back corner of a quiet diner. Mark looked older than I remembered, lines around his eyes, a weariness in his expression. He said he'd been at a party years ago, before my daughter was born, where he'd overheard something about my wife that didn't make sense at the time. "I thought it was just drunken gossip," he admitted, "but now I think it might have been real." I leaned in, urging him to go on, but before he could finish, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, went pale and mumbled, "I have to go." He left without even touching his coffee. That same night, I went to retrieve the birth certificate from where I'd left it on my desk, only to find it gone. The entire envelope had vanished. I tore the room apart, checking drawers, shelves, even the trash, but it was nowhere. My wife swore she hadn't seen it. I searched the rest of the house, every possible hiding spot, until I ended up in my daughter's room. She was already asleep, clutching her stuffed bear. On her nightstand was a folded piece of paper. I picked it up and unfolded it, expecting a drawing, but instead, it was a shaky childlike scrawl that made my blood run cold. It said, "Don't ask mommy about the other man." I stood there, frozen, staring at those words while my mind tried to make sense of it. Was it really her handwriting? Was it planted there? And if it was, who put it there, and how did they know exactly how to push me deeper into doubt? Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. I didn't move for a long time after hearing that floorboard creak. The house was wrapped in that heavy kind of nighttime silence where even the smallest sound feels amplified, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. My first thought was that my wife had gotten up for a glass of water, but something in me knew that wasn't it. The sound hadn't come from the hallway or the kitchen. It had come from inside the walls of my daughter's room, like someone was standing just beyond the thin plaster. I put the note back exactly where I'd found it, not wanting to risk my daughter waking up, and stepped out into the hallway. That's when I noticed the faint light spilling from under the front door, like someone was standing outside with a flashlight. By the time I reached it and yanked the door open, the street was empty. No car idling, no footsteps retreating into the night, just the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. I barely slept, my mind chasing one question after another until dawn. But what threw me off even more was what happened later that morning. My sister Emily called me, her voice tight, almost trembling, asking if I had been sending her strange letters. I told her no, and she explained that she'd found an envelope wedged under her windshield wiper when she left for work. Inside was a single photo, grainy like it had been taken from a distance, of me standing in my own driveway holding my daughter in my arms. On the back, in the same jagged, childlike handwriting as the note I'd found in my daughter's room, were the words, "Ask him about the night in 2015. She didn't know what it meant, and for a moment, neither did I, until I realized 2015 was the year before my daughter was born. I hadn't even told Emily about the hospital results yet, so whoever left that note wasn't just trying to get to me, they were pulling other people into this, widening the circle. That detail rattled me because it meant one of two things: either someone very close to my family was orchestrating this, or someone on the outside knew enough about my life to know exactly who to target. I told Emily to keep the photo and not tell anyone else, not even her husband, until I could figure out what we were dealing with. But even as I said it, I realized how dangerous that made her. If someone was willing to come onto my property, slip notes into my daughter's room and stalk my relatives, what would they do next? And why was the year 2015 suddenly the key they wanted me to focus on? I tried to ground myself in facts, to retrace everything I could remember about that year, but the memories felt slippery. That was the year my wife's job started sending her out of town more often, the year we moved into this house, the year I'd reconnected with an old friend from college who had since dropped off the map entirely. And then there was one night, one I hadn't thought about in years, when my wife didn't come home until nearly 3 in the morning, claiming she'd been at a coworker's going-away party. I hadn't believed her even then, but I let it go because I didn't want to be that husband. Now I couldn't help but wonder if that was the night the message was pointing to, and if so, what had really happened. I went back to the hospital later that day, determined to push harder for the records. I walked in ready for a fight, but before I even got to the reception desk, a man I'd never seen before stepped in front of me. He was wearing a maintenance uniform, the kind you'd expect to see on someone fixing a light fixture, but there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. "Stop," he said quietly, glancing toward the security camera above us. "You're asking questions you don't want the answers to." I asked him who he was, how he knew my name, but he just shook his head and stepped aside, disappearing down a staff-only hallway. When I asked the receptionist if she knew him, she told me there was no one by that description on their maintenance team. And then came the twist I didn't see coming. While I was still at the hospital, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of the birth certificate I'd lost, the same one that had vanished from my desk. Only this time the father's name had been replaced with a third name I'd never seen before, and underneath it in red text it read, "Do you really know whose child she is?" My hands shook as I stared at it, and for the first time since this began, I felt the faintest ripple of fear, not just for myself, but for what might happen to my daughter if I kept digging. But the part that still keeps me up at night wasn't the note or the man at the hospital, or even the fact that someone was clearly following me. It was what I saw when I got home. Sitting on our front porch was my daughter's stuffed bear, the one she had been holding when I tucked her in the night before, its fabric soaked from the rain, its button eyes gouged out and replaced with 2 small rolled-up slips of paper. When I unrolled the first one it said, "You're running out of time." The second one was just a single date. And it wasn't 2015. It was tomorrow. I didn't sleep at all that night, not with that bear sitting in a plastic bag on the kitchen counter like some kind of silent warning, those 2 slips of paper burning in the back of my mind. I kept replaying the date over and over, tomorrow, and wondering what it meant. Was it the deadline for something? Was something going to happen to my daughter, to me, to someone else? I sat in the dark with only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the house settling, my thoughts turning into a mess of possibilities that only made the panic worse. Every shadow outside the window looked like a person. Every passing car slowed down just enough to feel suspicious. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't just being watched anymore, I was being hunted. By morning my nerves were raw. I made sure to drop my daughter at school myself, walking her all the way to the door even though she insisted she could go in alone. I told her I loved her, probably too many times, and stood there longer than I should have, watching her vanish into the building. On the drive home, I noticed a black SUV a few car lengths behind me. At first I thought it was nothing, just another commuter, but when I took an unexpected left turn instead of heading straight home, it followed. I sped up slightly, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, and sure enough, it stayed with me through another turn and then another. My pulse hammered in my ears. I pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot, hoping the traffic would break them off, but when I looked back a minute later, the SUV was parked 3 rows away, the windows tinted too dark to see inside. I decided not to go straight home and instead drove to Emily's place. I figured if someone was following me, maybe I could confront them in a more public area, somewhere I wasn't alone. But when I pulled up outside her apartment building, her car wasn't there. I called her, expecting her to pick up right away, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a quick message asking her to call me back, trying not to let my worries show in my voice. I was halfway back to my car when I noticed the small white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. My chest tightened as I pulled it free. Inside was a single photograph, Emily's, taken from across the street, her face half turned as if she'd just realized someone was watching her. On the back, in the same jagged handwriting I'd come to dread, were the words, "She won't help you now." I drove home in a fog, my mind struggling to process what that meant. Had something happened to her? Was this a warning for me to stop dragging other people into it? By the time I pulled into my driveway, the SUV was gone, but the sense of being followed clung to me like smoke. Inside, the house felt colder than it should have been, the air heavy in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went to check the kitchen window and froze. Across the street, behind the curtains of an upstairs window in the empty house that had been for sale for months, I saw the faintest movement, just enough to catch the light. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel it. Someone was there and they were watching me. Every instinct screamed at me to call the police, but what was I going to say? That someone might be following me? That strange notes were showing up? That a stuffed bear had been mutilated and left on my porch? It all sounded like the kind of thing that could be explained away, and I didn't have anything concrete to prove otherwise. And that's when the phone rang. It was an unknown number, the same one that had sent me the altered birth certificate photo. I answered, my voice sharper than I intended. At first there was only static, and then a voice, distorted, low, said, "If you want her to stay safe, stop asking about 2015. You have until midnight tomorrow." The line went dead before I could say a word. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, my mind cycling through every possibility, every person who could be behind this, every reason someone would want to keep me away from that year. The fear wasn't just about what might happen anymore, it was about the realization that this wasn't random. Whoever was behind this didn't just know me. They knew exactly where to hit me hardest. And the worst part was, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could protect my daughter from what was coming. I felt my stomach drop as the nurse's voice played back in my mind, that cold, clinical tone she'd used when she'd said the word unrelated, like she was reading a weather report and not tearing apart the very foundation of my life. 4 days, I had been clinging to the hope that it was a clerical error, that somewhere in the hospital's labyrinth of paperwork and blood vials, my name and results had simply gotten mixed up with someone else's. But now, standing in my kitchen with the blinds half closed, staring at the message that had just lit up my phone, I knew the hospital's call wasn't just a mistake, it was a warning. The message wasn't from the hospital this time. It came from an unknown number, a simple text with no punctuation. "Stop asking questions if you want to keep your family safe." My fingers froze around the phone, every muscle in my body locked, because the word family suddenly didn't feel as solid as it had a week ago. I didn't even hear the door open until I felt the cold gust of air behind me. My neighbor, Paul, stepped inside like he owned the place, no knock, no hesitation, just that calm but calculating look he'd always had. I'd known him for years. Our daughters had played together in the yard, our wives swapped casserole recipes, and we borrowed tools from each other without a second thought. But there was something different in his eyes now, like he was weighing whether I was worth telling the truth to. He sat down at my table, leaned forward, and slid a small envelope across the wood. "You're not gonna like what's in there," he said quietly, and I could tell from his tone he wasn't trying to scare me, he was trying to prepare me. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased, of a hospital room I didn't recognize. My wife was in the picture holding a baby, not our baby. And standing next to her was a man I'd never seen before. When I tried to ask Paul where he got it, he just shook his head and said, "That's not my story to tell. But I will tell you this, people in this town have long memories, and if you keep poking at things that were buried a long time ago, you won't just find out the truth about your daughter. You'll find out things about your wife you can't unlearn." My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear him, and in that moment I realized something horrifying. This wasn't just about blood results or medical mistakes. This was about an entire history I had never been told, a history that might have been deliberately kept from me. but before I could press him for more, his phone buzzed. He looked down, his face paled, and he muttered something about having to leave immediately. He stood so fast his chair tipped over, and without another word he was gone, leaving the photograph in the heavy silence behind. I sat there staring at that image, my hands shaking because I was beginning to suspect that Paul wasn't just a neighbor caught up in this by chance. He knew more than he was willing to say, and his sudden exit made me think he might be the reason certain answers had been kept from me in the first place. And then, just as I was about to tuck the photograph away, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, something in the background. A reflection in the glass panel of the hospital door, blurred but distinct enough to make my skin crawl. Someone was standing there, watching, wearing the exact same jacket I'd seen outside my own house last night. That meant whoever was watching me now had been watching me for longer than I thought. It was almost unbearable now, the way every conversation seemed to carry a second, hidden meaning, every look lingered a fraction too long, and every silence felt like it was pregnant with secrets. I could barely sit still at the dinner table that night, the air thick with unspoken tension as my fork scraped against the plate. Across from me, the person I'd once trusted with everything, someone who had been my anchor through every storm, sat with the faintest trace of a smirk, like they knew I was cornered. The problem was they weren't my only suspect anymore. Every friend who texted me, "Are you okay?" seemed a little too curious. Every coworker who just happened to bring up small-town gossip about people disappearing made me wonder if they were trying to warn me or scare me. And when I finally stepped outside to clear my head, a car I didn't recognize rolled slowly past, its headlights lingering on me before it turned the corner. My pulse spiked. I knew, absolutely knew I was being watched. That night the ultimatum came. It wasn't in a phone call or a dramatic showdown, it was in an envelope slipped under my front door, the paper cold in my trembling hands. The message was short but devastating. Stop asking questions or someone you care about won't make it through the week. The problem was, it didn't say who. It could have been my sister, my best friend, or the person I'd been secretly meeting with for answers. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, my entire world narrowing to two impossible choices: protect the people I loved by letting this nightmare stay buried, or keep digging and risk losing someone I couldn't bear to live without. My chest tightened, the kind of pressure you feel when you know that no matter what decision you make, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. Worse yet, as I sat frozen in my kitchen with the envelope clutched in my hand, I heard the sound of my phone buzzing on the counter. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "I know which one you'll choose." And that was the moment I realized something horrifying. They weren't just threatening me, they were predicting me. They knew how I thought, how I acted, maybe even what I feared most. That meant whoever was behind this wasn't just in my life now, they had been in it for a very, very long time. It all started unraveling faster than I could process, like a thread yanked from the edge of a sweater until the whole thing was coming apart in my hands. I thought this was about one threat, one mysterious person watching me from the shadows, but the deeper I went, the more I saw how wrong I had been. It wasn't just me, they had files on other people too. Not random strangers, but faces I recognized from my neighborhood, co-workers who'd smiled at me in the hallway, even the couple who waved from their porch every morning when I drove to work. They weren't just names in a folder. There were photos, bank records, GPS logs showing their every movement, like we were all part of some massive surveillance project hiding in plain sight. My stomach knotted as I realized this wasn't a case of bad luck or a personal vendetta. This was a system, a machine, and I had been living inside it without even knowing. The worst part was that the person who confirmed it for me was the last one I ever would have suspected. I had gone to them desperate for advice, clinging to the belief that they were the one person I could trust, and they let me talk, let me spill every fear and suspicion until my voice was shaking. Then they smiled, slow, almost sad, and said they'd been trying to keep me out of it for months. My mind rebelled against the words, but then they pulled out a phone and showed me messages, hundreds of them, between themselves and someone higher up, discussing me like I was a chess piece on a board they'd been moving for years. I felt the blood drain from my face as they admitted they weren't trying to protect me, they were trying to manage me, to make sure I didn't disrupt the plan before it was ready. The betrayal burned in my chest, but the real terror came when they told me the plan was already in motion. That I wasn't just in danger from whoever was watching me, I was a key part of whatever was about to happen, and my role wasn't optional. Outside, I could hear faint noises, tires on gravel, distant voices, footsteps moving with purpose. The walls felt too thin, the night air pressing in through every crack. Somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about choosing whether I would let them use me, or whether I would burn the whole thing down even if it meant going down with it. By the time I reached the old factory, The air was already humming with the low vibration of generators, a constant electric thrum that made my teeth ache. The building loomed against the sky like a carcass stripped bare, its windows blackened, its walls coated in years of dust and secrecy. I had followed the trail here, piecing together every scrap of truth they had tried to bury, and I knew, without any doubt, that this was where it all ended. Inside, the smell of rust and oil mixed with something sharper, almost chemical, and every step echoed like a warning in the cavernous space. Then I saw them, the one who had been pulling the strings from the beginning, standing in the center of the room beneath a flickering light, surrounded by a semicircle of monitors, each one displaying a different face I recognized. Friends, neighbors, strangers I'd brushed past in grocery store aisles. All part of the same web. They didn't flinch when I approached. If anything, they looked almost relieved, as if I'd finally arrived right on schedule. "You've been searching for the truth," they said, their voice smooth, too calm, "but you've only been chasing the version we allowed you to find." My hands tightened around the folder I'd been carrying, the last piece of evidence I had: photographs, bank transfers, coded emails, proof that tied every ugly thread back to them. I laid it out between us, the pages fluttering in the draft from a broken window, and for the first time, their expression faltered. But then they stepped forward, closing the space between us, and lowered their voice to a whisper I could barely hear over the hum of the generators. "This isn't just about you. This isn't even about them," they gestured to the screens. "You've been part of this since the day you were born. Everything you've done, every choice you think you made, it's all been written." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. I wanted to deny it, to cling to the belief that my life was still mine, but then they pulled out a thin leather-bound book from their coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. I flipped it open with trembling hands, and there it was. My entire life, from childhood to this exact moment, documented in neat, clinical handwriting. Dates, events, conversations, even my thoughts, written down word for word. My pulse roared in my ears as I turned page after page until I reached the very end, where the last entry read, "You will choose to join us." I looked up, but they were already watching me with that same calm certainty, as if the choice had already been made. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, the air thick with the scent of ozone and inevitability. I could feel the world narrowing to two impossible options: walk away and live knowing I would never escape their reach, or destroy everything, including myself, to sever the chain. My fingers tightened on the book, and for a split second, I saw it in their eyes, the first flicker of doubt. That was when I made my decision. I didn't tear the book in half. I didn't throw it in the fire. Instead, I pulled out the single page they had never expected me to see, buried at the very back, written in different ink, almost as if someone else had hidden it there, and read the final line aloud. "The one who wrote this is not the one you think." Their smile vanished. That was when the lights cut out, the monitors went black, and somewhere in the shadows behind me, another voice spoke my name. The world seemed to exhale the moment the lights came back on, revealing the empty factory around me, the book still lying open on the table, but the figure who had haunted my life for months nowhere to be found. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly ebbing and leaving a hollow ache in its place. For the first time in weeks, the air felt less like a trap and more like it might be breathable again, but the silence was different now, heavy with questions that didn't have answers. I gathered the book, the photographs, every shred of evidence I had, and carried it out into the night, each step echoing in the empty streets like a heartbeat trying to catch up with itself. My daughter was waiting at home, asleep in her bed, unaware of how close danger had brushed against us, and I stared at her peaceful face and realized that while I couldn't change the past or fully understand the labyrinth of secrets I had been pulled into, I could protect the present, hold on to the people I loved, and rebuild what had been fractured by lies. In the following days, I started to piece together the fragments I had: the messages, the threats, the hidden alliances, and the betrayals. Some things were impossible to prove, some would forever remain conjecture, and some truths were so sharp that even knowing them hurt more than ignorance ever could. Emily eventually reappeared, shaken but unharmed, and we sat for hours piecing together the evidence we both had, realizing that the conspiracy was bigger than any of us could have imagined, a network that had quietly reached into the lives of ordinary families like ours, shaping events and rewriting histories behind a veil we could barely glimpse. And yet, through all that, there was a strange sense of clarity. I knew who I could trust now, not everyone, certainly not those who smiled while keeping secrets, but the core of my family, the ones whose names I whispered in the dark and whose laughter filled the house. They were untouchable, not because the world outside had changed, but because I had changed how fiercely I would protect them. The final twist didn't arrive in a thunderclap or a confrontation. It came quietly, like the way shadows shift just before dawn. As I returned to the hospital to confirm what I could about the blood test results, I found a single note taped to the bottom of my daughter's chart. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It simply said, * you're closer than you know. Watch carefully. * that line, that faint trace of someone watching from the edges, reminded me that some mysteries never fully resolve, that the world has layers you can only peek beneath but never fully uncover. It left me unsettled, yes, but also oddly alive, because now I was awake to the possibility that the truths we search for are not always what they seem, and the people we love are both fragile and infinitely resilient. In the quiet of my home, I watched my daughter draw on her coloring book again, her crayons scattered across the table like confetti, the sunlight catching her hair just so, and I realized that the most important victories are the ones you can see, feel, and hold. I had survived the threats, the manipulation, the hidden betrayals, and though the shadows lingered, though questions still pulsed at the edges of my mind, I had a family that was real, present, and mine in a way that no conspiracy, no falsehood could undo. And as I tucked her in that night, the pages of the book safely locked away, I whispered a promise to her that I meant with every fiber of my being. No one would take her from me, not even the truth itself. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the story wasn't over. Someone somewhere was still watching. Someone somewhere was still waiting. And maybe that was the lesson. Life would always have mysteries, shadows, and secrets, but it was up to me to choose what I carried forward, and what I refused to let control me.